Time now for Sid at 6-0. This is where I get 60 seconds to talk about anything I want. Start the clock, please. Here's what's on my mind this morning. This was not how the season was supposed to go for the Vancouver Canucks. Despite one of the brightest young cores in the game of hockey, despite going out this past offseason and grabbing an upper-tier defenseman in Oliver Ekman-Larsson, the Canucks have been terrible this year. Second worst record in the Western Conference. Fans were getting restless. And GM Jim Benning was the main target. There were a few, but he was the main. Chants of fire Benning could be heard at Rogers Arena for weeks, if not months. Hashtag fire Benning trended on Twitter after every loss. Then this past Saturday happened against the Penguins. What am I talking about? This is what I'm talking about. Someone tossed a jersey onto the ice. The ultimate sign of fan frustration, chucking a $200 item of clothing in disgust. Ownership seemed to be paying attention. Last night, they cleaned house. It happened. GM Jim Benning fired. Head coach Travis Green fired. The current feel in the organization couldn't continue. Time for a change. It is a perfect Monday for a Marek Monday here on Breakfast Television. Jeff Marek from the Jeff Marek Show and 32 Thoughts, the podcast. Great to see you. All right, so why now if you're the Aquilinis in Vancouver?
I think you nailed it with the Pittsburgh Penguins game. I think when they saw the jersey on the ice, that was it. Now, I know there was a family meeting of all the Aquilinis earlier on that day, probably to discuss what the next plans were going to be. But I think you're right on the mark. Like they could have done this. Like this was the slowest moving hockey story we've seen in years, Sid. We all knew it was going to get to this point where both Jim Benning and Travis Green were fired. It was only a matter of when we were going to get there. You know, after the Anaheim game, after the Vegas game. Didn't do it. They won 2 games this past week, but Pittsburgh put the final nail in the coffin. And you're right, the jersey hitting the ice, well, you know, it was the captain, Bo Horvat's jersey as well, to add salt on an open wound. That was pretty much it for the Aquilini family. I think the coach firing was a mercy firing. The Benning firing had been coming for a long time. Second
Canadian team in 8 days to basically clean house. The Habs did it a week from this past Sunday.
Yeah.
So who's coming in to be the coach, and for how long, and the GM, and for how long? What are you hearing?
Torontonian Bruce Boudreau comes in and take over from Travis Green behind the bench, so that'll be interesting. Vancouver's never had a coach quite like Bruce Boudreau before, and if you're an offensive player with the Vancouver Canucks, you love this move. Stan Smeel takes over the general manager capacity on an interim basis. They're looking for their full-time GM still, but it's Gabby time, Sid, and you know Bruce. It's Gabby time in Vancouver now.
How does that work with the kids?
What's that? How does it work with the kids?
Yeah.
The thing about Bruce Boudreau is if you're an offensive player, he's opening and closing the door for you. Go do your thing.
Good point.
This is still a team that doesn't have, they have Nils Höglander and stuff, Vasily Podkolzin, but it's not. This isn't about the kids. This is about trying to maximize what you have in Brock Besser, in JT Miller, and Elias Pettersson. You mentioned Oliver Ekman-Larsson. I think this is more about getting those players going than any of the younger kids on the team.
Finally, Jeff, it was not that long ago, really, when a team around Christmas named the St. Louis Blues were dead last, made a coaching change.
What are you suggesting?
I'm not suggesting the Canucks are going to win the Stanley Cup here, but it's not unheard of. Listen, there's 57 games left. Like there's runway here for the Canucks to get it right. Do you think they do?
You know, that's an interesting question because, you know, the one thing we know about Bruce Boudreau is he can jolt a team. He can shock a team. Like the thing that everybody wonders about is, you know, he's that in case of emergency break glass coaching move. Because the one thing we've seen with Gabby, whether it's Washington, which he did in his first season back in 07-08, finally took them to the playoffs, whether it's the Anaheim Ducks or most recently the Minnesota Wild, short term, this guy gets results out of teams. So it may sound ridiculous and we may snicker at it here in December, but if anyone's going to jolt this team into winning again, this is the guy to do it, Sid.
A brand new 32 Thoughts, the podcast with Jeff and Elliot Friedman is out this morning listen, a shakeup like this in the Canadian market, it is massive news. Give it a listen. Jeff Marek Show today at noon on Sportsnet 590 The Fan also will be interesting. Jeff, we appreciate you. Have a good day. Busy.